Hello, and welcome to your training module on the International Bill of Rights. Now, as we covered in the last module, the earliest mention of the right to adequate housing, as it is now understood in international law, dates back to 1948, just after World War II, when countries across the globe came together to form the United Nations and then ultimately create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also known as the UDHR. And crafted by leaders and nations from across the world, this UDHR set out for the first time a universal standard for fundamental human rights, like the right to housing, which are all considered to be intertwined, interdependent, and indivisible, which means they cannot be considered in isolation from one another. But of course, at the time, the UDHR was not legally binding, nor was it attached with any sort of accountability mechanism. And so these human rights were further fleshed out into two binding treaties or international covenants in 1966. And the right to adequate housing was articulated in one of those covenants called the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And so together, those two covenants and the UDHR make up the International Bill of Rights, which is the basis for all of international human rights law, which will be covered in this module. But what's interesting about this, and what you may already be wondering, is why were indivisible rights divided into two covenants? And it's a great question, and there's no real reason other than ideological conflict. So interestingly, history plays a big role here, but with the Cold War brewing between the United States and then Soviet Union, the world was quickly divided yet again, and civil and political rights became linked with Western capitalism and democracy, as it was perceived at the time, whereas economic, social, and cultural rights, like the right to housing, were linked with socialist values. So instead of a single treaty as originally envisioned, countries were given the option to ratify either or both covenants. And importantly, while some countries chose to only ratify one, Canada ratified both. So, this is relevant in your work because it is useful to remember that while Canada has prioritized implementing civil and political rights in alignment with its political allies like the US and so on, it has still ratified both covenants. So, that means that it's not that civil and political rights are necessarily easier to implement, but that this was a political choice. It's what advocates are always telling us. These are policy choices and changes about political will. And so you can therefore use examples of other rights that have been more effectively implemented. For example, the right to vote. I mean, there are certainly still gaps and equity issues there, but you can use those types of examples to demonstrate and encourage Canada to make progress on the right to housing. And in fact, you can even link the right to housing to civil and political rights. For example, the right to life, which we know is seriously compromised when folks are experiencing homelessness or other forms of housing precarity. And in fact, the right to life is also captured in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But anyway, this is all to say that you can put these different human rights in conversation to encourage governments to prioritize the most urgent and intersectional issues pertaining to homelessness and inadequate housing. So just because Canada has not prioritized the right to housing historically doesn't mean that it cannot do so going forward. And you can be a force for progress by drawing creative connections between the two covenants and remembering that they truly are indivisible, that all human rights need to be advanced as a collective. So I wish you the best of luck on that journey and enjoy this module.